Good evening, Manchester. Welcome to the Girard at Large television show. I'm John DiPietro, sitting in for Rich tonight, who is in a super secret Board of School Committee meeting. But don't change the channel, because despite the fact that I'm hosting tonight, it's actually going to be an awesome show. The reason that it's going to be a terrific show tonight is that I have a guest host joining me, Ian Underwood, who is... He's not a rocket scientist. He's actually smarter than a rocket scientist. He actually wrote artificial intelligence software for NASA, which I think is even cooler than being a rocket scientist. And now he is an education advocate. And I ran into Ian a couple of weeks ago at a conference, and he was on a panel on school choice, and made some really interesting points, and I talked to him afterwards and thought he had some fascinating views on education, and so I looked him up online and saw a presentation that he had done to a school board a while back, and I thought it was just phenomenal. So struck up a conversation with him, and as it turns out, there was an opportunity to guest host for Rich on the show tonight, and so he and I are here tonight, and Ian is going to present some information that I think is really important about schools. Executive Counselor Andrew Valinsky, as a lot of you probably know, is going around the state. He's got sort of a traveling road show where he's talking predominantly, if not exclusively, about school funding. And there are a few issues that we're going to cover tonight, and funding is one of them. And the point that Ian makes that I agree with is that if you're talking about school funding, you're having the wrong discussion. What we really need to be talking about is fairness in education. So there's a few things we're going to cover. We're going to start by talking about or explaining why, if you're talking about school funding, you're having the wrong conversation. And then we'll transition into talking about this concept of fairness and what we think it means. And then what I really like about the way that he presents this is we're going to end the discussion by talking about solutions, like real solutions, and defining adequacy. As we all know, adequacy is a really important word, when it comes to our education system in New Hampshire these days. So, as you might guess, a lot of school districts around the state have been welcoming Valinsky's traveling roadshow with open arms, and you probably be shocked to hear he's only presenting one side of the argument. So we're going to illuminate some other sides of the argument and present some information and some graphs that we think really tell the story, and I think Ian does a great job of communicating this information. So appreciate Rich giving us this opportunity tonight to cover this information. So the first section of the presentation is called School Funding in 3 Graphs and 2 Jokes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian at this point to start off with the first joke, I think, right?
Yeah, we start with a joke. So a guy walks into a kitchen just in time to see his wife cut off the end of a roast and throw it away. And he goes, "Honey, why'd you throw away the end of the roast?" She says, "Well, that's just how you cook a roast. That's how my mom did it." And so they call her up and they say, "Mom, why'd you cut the end off the roast?" She said, "Well, that's what my mom always did. It's just how you cook a roast." So they call up the grandmother and say, "Grandma, why'd you cut the end off the roast?" And she said, "Well, I always cut the end off the roast because my roaster was too small." Right? And I love this joke because I think it explains about 30% of all politics and about 90% of what happens in schools, right? But I also love it because, like all really good jokes, it makes an important point. And the important point it makes is it is absolutely crucial to stop now and then and ask yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing? Am I actually solving a problem? Is it a problem I have? Is it a problem I used to have? Do I still have it? Did I ever have it? And that's especially important when your solutions to your problem are bankrupting you, right? That's a very good time to stop and say, why am I doing this? So it turns out schools are a solution to a problem, but the problem is scarcity. Okay, if you live in a world where books are scarce and expensive, where things like paper and pencil are hard to get, you have a chalkboard is expensive, teachers are hard to find, then it makes perfect sense to take kids and put them on buses and send them to some, or, covered wagons, whatever, horses.
Mm-hmm.
You send them to some place where they can share those resources. And I think of it as sort of like arcades, right? For a while, you wanted to play Pac-Man, you had to go to an arcade because who could afford to have that in their home? You had to share all that.
And I just wanted to emphasize, the whole concept of scarcity is something like, I do digital marketing for a living, right? And scarcity is a really important concept, both in terms of marketing and in terms of economics, right? I mean, those are the driving forces behind free markets. It's all about, supply and demand and scarcity. So I think it's really it's a useful concept, a useful way to think about education.
But the thing is, those resources are no longer scarce, right? If you've got a phone, you got a laptop, you got you're sitting at McDonald's, you have a Wi-Fi connection. You have instantaneous access to anything that anybody has ever known. And more importantly for the concept of schools, you have people lined up, right? Dozens, hundreds of people lined up to teach you anything that you want to know, often for free or some nominal fee, right? And so this idea that we should be pursuing this solution, which is really for a problem that we don't have, is, well, we can make a prediction, right? You can ask this question. If you throw money at a problem that you don't actually have, what should you expect to see over time? And what you should expect to see is your costs should go up as you keep spending money, and your results should stay flat or get worse. And in fact, Paul, if you want to put up slide 2, that's exactly what happens, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is a great... It's a graph. It's put together by Andrew Coulson at Cato, but it's using the government's own figures, their figures for spending, their figures on the NAEP test, which is the nation's report card. That is, they are the experts. They're saying this is how we wish to be measured. And when you look at this thing, basically adjusted for inflation, we have since 1970, we've tripled spending and gotten no increase in achievement. And this is the kind of thing that doesn't get talked about when you're just talking about, well, what should the tax rate be? Who should pay more? Who should pay less? What matters is, basically, this is half a century. This is generations of kids. This is sweeping changes in pedagogy and assessment. This is multiple technological revolutions. You think about where technology was in 1970, and yet it doesn't make any difference. And so, this graph, I think once you've seen this graph, it should be impossible to unsee it, right? And what this graph answers is, is more money the answer? And it's not. The answer is no, right? So if more money isn't the answer, well, what is the answer, right? And that leads us to the second graph. Paul, can you put up number 3? So in this graph, what are we looking at? Each of these dots represents a state, 50 states. And the horizontal axis tells you how much are they spending per student per year. And the vertical axis tells you what score did they get on the 4th grade NAEP reading test. Now that's one particular test. There are several grades, there are several subjects, but they all give you the same picture, okay? So here's the interesting things to note about this picture. One of them is, if you look at that horizontal rectangle, what you see are a bunch of states that are paying wildly different amounts of money to get the same results, right? Yeah. Some states paying $6,000, some states paying $20,000. We're somewhere in the middle there, around 15. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem to matter how much you pay.
And I want to interject there, because this is a point that I make almost on a weekly basis, discussing education in Manchester, right? Because the thing that people hammer constantly in Manchester is they compare us to surrounding towns. And if you look at the state's data, right, it is true that Manchester is near the bottom in terms of per student spending. And I make 2 points on that. Number one, it doesn't matter. And that's what your graph that we were just looking at proves, right? You've got wildly different amounts of money. I mean, that graph, instead of being 50 states, could be 50 cities and towns in New Hampshire, and it would look exactly the same. you'd get wildly divergent results. And the second point that I make is it better be cheaper in Manchester because we have massive economies of scale.
Yes. Yeah. So, this, there's a couple other things to notice. One of them is Kentucky and New Jersey are labeled because in his roadshow, Volinsky says that those are two states that have fixed the problem. And, you look at that, where they are in terms of spending, and it's just hard to imagine what problem they could have both had that they both fixed. And maybe the most important thing, which would miss people, there's a red line across the top. And that's the thing about NAEP scores is nobody really knows what a NAEP score means. This is up on a scale of 500, and these scores are around 200 something. So that red line represents what would be sort of the minimum passing score for a state, where that state could be, okay, we're not failing. And the thing to notice is we're all failing. Every state is failing. New Hampshire, people like to say, oh, look how well we're doing relative to other states, but New Hampshire is just failing a little less badly than the rest of the country. And so the other graph answered the question, will more money help? No. This graph answers the question, well, how much should we be spending? And the thing is, as you noted, it's the wrong question. Right? And so even if you think you've got the right answer to the wrong question, it's still the wrong answer. It doesn't help. And that brings us to the third graph. So, Paul, if you could put up number 4. So this, I just find this amazing, and this came out of some preliminary stuff that was released when Volinsky first started his presentations, where they were trying to demonstrate with a graph that nothing had happened. There had been no results since Claremont. We were looking at that, and we're just like, okay, what did they do? And I wrote a blog about this on Granite Grok, where you showed these tricks they played to make it look like nothing had happened. And when you actually sort everything the right way, and you're comparing a district in 1998 to a district now, you get this incredibly different picture. And what the picture says is, and these numbers on the bottom, it's what they were spending, the districts are spending in 1998, adjusted for inflation. So these numbers are directly comparable. And on the top, it's what they're spending now. And you can see that spending is just all over the place, although it's all up. And for me, the really fascinating thing about this is, again, there's a red line. And if you look at that red line, except for Waterville Valley, which is just an outlier, every district now is spending more than even the richest districts were spending then.
Adjusted for inflation.
Adjusted for inflation.
Right.
Every district is now a rich district, okay? And it hasn't helped. So are we going to make them into even richer districts? Andrew Volinsky went to the Supreme Court and got them to stand Article 83 of the state constitution on its head. And in so doing, this is a crusade to reform school spending. And so this is what it costs us, $10,000 per student per year. And so the question people really need to be asking themselves is, can we afford the next crusade? Because I don't think we can. And so now we come to the second joke. If you put up number 5. So the joke is, the guy is crawling. He's crawling around in the street looking for something, and a cop comes by and sees him. He says, "What are you looking for?" And he says, "Well, I'm looking for my wallet." And the cop says, "Well, I'll help you look." And after a while, he says, "Are you sure you lost it here? Because it doesn't seem to be here." And he says, "Well, no, I lost it over in the park." And the cop says, "So why are you looking for it here?" And he says, "Because the light's better here." Right? I mean, this is an old joke, but again, like the best jokes. It makes an important point, right? And so in the context of schools, focusing on achievement is hard, okay? It's clear that even experts don't really have a very good idea of why you put a bunch of kids in the same situation, some learn and some don't. And if you start really looking at what leads to achievement, what leads away from achievement, one of the things that's dangerous and uncomfortable is we are likely to find that some of the things we cherish, that we think this is how you cut the end off the roast, this is how you cook the roast, this is how you run a school, you may find that some of those are doing more harm than good. And that is going to cause a lot of discomfort for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, money's easy. We know what to do with money. We take them for that guy, we give it to those guys. We have formulas, we have spreadsheets, we have tax rates. We know how to do this. And so, in the presentation that I give, if there's one thing I want people to remember, it's this. Money is the lamppost of education. Okay? As long as we are sticking under that lamppost and talking about money, how much things should be, whether there should be stabilization grants, what tax rates should be, as long as we're doing that, the wallet is over in the park.
Yeah.
And we're never going to find it, right? So the first thing I think that needs to happen is there needs to be some public awareness that talking about money is not just not solving the issue, it's preventing us from finding the answers that we need.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. And it's like you said earlier, right? The right answer to the wrong question is still the wrong answer.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just another way of, and the joke sort of ties a bow on that. So now we're going to so that's the whole concept of school funding, and I think that's a good explanation as to why that's the wrong conversation to be having. So now we sort of turn our attention to, all right, so what conversation should we be having? And your point is that we should be talking about fairness.
Yes.
So let's talk about fairness.
Okay. So I think fairness is actually the reason we're obsessed with money. Because that, in fact, when Volinsky went to court, that was the argument he raised. It is not fair that some towns get this and some towns don't get that. It's not fair. And unfortunately, it became all about money. And since then, it's always been about money. How much are we spending? It's not fair if you get more money or if you have a higher tax rate to get the same amount of money, right? And so I think that nothing really can change until that changes, until we stop automatically equating the word fair with some kind of equality in spending, right? And I think there is, and what I'd like to talk about tonight is I think there is an idea of fairness which actually takes us away from money and towards achievement. And one of the things that a lot of people come away from Volinsky's presentation noticing is he didn't say anything about achievement. There's not 10 seconds in that presentation that actually talk about whether the kids are doing better or worse or what we're going to do about that. It is completely about money, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that as we go towards, let's just move towards it. So, Paul, if you can bring up number 6. So here we see a picture of our current educational system, basically, just captured in a little simple graph. And what it says is we stick some kids in school for 12 years and we see what happens, right? And at the end of 12 years, some of those kids are taking college-level courses. They're doing CNC programming. They are taking AP courses and essentially going way beyond what anybody would call an adequate education. This is, it's a Ferrari education. On the other hand, some of these kids haven't learned to read, right? And there's a number that gets tossed around a lot. We have our graduation rate is above 90%, but our proficiency rate is around 40%. Which means we're putting out a lot of kids who haven't actually learned the things that they were supposed to be learning, right?
Yeah. And Commissioner Edelblue talks about this a lot.
Yes.
He talks about the whole concept of cohorts, right?
Yeah.
And that basically, what we, in order to believe that we have the correct, in air quotes, right, the correct education model, you have to believe that every kid, you basically have to believe in astrology, right? You have to believe that every kid born in August is going to learn and mature at the same rate as every other kid born in August of that year. Yeah. And when you think about it, it's absolutely absurd. Right?
It is, and if you went to an astrologist and he said, well, this year or today, because you were born on this day, you should do such and such, and you think, okay, really? But if you say, well, because you were born on such and such a date, today you should be learning about the pharaohs of Egypt and the Pythagorean theorem and whatever, and nobody laughs. And I just find that amazing because it's like, really? You can just tell that from my birthday what I should be doing today? That's, it's crazy. And the idea is crazy, but it's crazier that nobody recognizes how crazy it is. So anyways, this is the picture that we have now. And because everybody goes the same 12 years, and it's about $15,000 a year, this is $180,000. That's the cost of a house, okay? Which, for a long time, I didn't do the addition there, but when you see it, it's like, really the cost of a house to teach kids to be able to read and do some thinking. It's astonishing. So If we go to number 7.
And just to put a point on that, you're paying. You said you're paying $180,000 to teach kids to read. You're paying that to teach some kids to read.
Right, some kids. Some kids aren't
Some
getting
of them
it,
don't
right?
even get there.
Yeah. So if we look at this slide, number 7, it shows that there are 2 kinds of unfairness that
Right.
exist in this system, right? So there's a red triangle and a blue triangle. And the blue triangle, the one on the bottom, is essentially just sort of picturing, here's all the stuff that kid was supposed to learn, and he's not going to because he turns 18. Hey, see ya, good luck, right? So it's unfair to him. It's unfair to his parents. It's unfair to everybody who has to deal with him for the rest of his life. And the red triangle represents all the things that taxpayers are paying for because you have to keep this kid around. He's basically, well, I'm ready to leave, but you're making me stay here, so you better give me something to do, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a thing I like to think of, like, imagine, you put something in the oven, and it says 40 minutes, and after 40 minutes, it's still frozen. And then in the next oven, after 20 minutes, it's burning, and you're like, okay, but the recipe says 40 minutes, right? You're not really paying attention to what's going on. So this is unfair to students. The top thing is unfair to taxpayers. You're asking these people, they're supposed to be on the hook for an adequate education, and this is way beyond an adequate education. So why are they still paying? So those are 2 kinds of unfairness that come out of, they just fall out as a consequence of only paying attention to money. We don't notice this happening even though it's right there in front of us.
Yeah, and I want to dwell on this for a minute because this was the slide in your presentation that just blew my mind. Not because I didn't know this already, and I think most people sort of have an intuitive feeling that the system is inherently unfair. But I think this graph does a great job at illustrating it. And I also think, a lot of people know that kids today, because nobody wants to tell somebody that they failed, right?
Right.
So there are a lot of kids that are getting pushed on in grades. They're getting past, up to their next level. But they haven't mastered the material. Right. And the whole reason for that is this cohort model that we talked about before, and the thing that I think, again, you brilliantly point out is that if people really just stopped for a minute and thought about it, they would laugh at it because it is so absurd. Right? But we all just sit back and, oh yeah, that's the way it's done. Yeah.
Well, my point though is we never even have that discussion. We never talk about it because we're too busy talking about money. And this is
and everybody in that blue triangle should be outraged.
Absolutely.
Should be out in the street with pitchforks and torches and should be absolutely outraged at the unfairness of the system. And again, to harp on that point, the unfairness is not in the funding. The unfairness is in the results.
It's in the
that
results,
nobody is talking about.
Right, yeah. So, what we have to do is actually think about why are we doing this in the first place? Why am I taking your money to educate his kids? Why am I taking her money to educate his kids, right? And so if you actually go back and look at what started this, and even the Supreme Courts, as goofy as their logic was, they were very clear about the idea is to create educated citizens, right? To provide enough education or the opportunity to become educated to the point that's necessary, it's an important word, necessary, to participate in our system of government and the economy. That's why we're doing this. We're not doing it to be charitable. We're not doing it because it's fun. We're not doing it because, well, every kid is you like to think every kid is a precious flower and should be handled, to grow as nicely as possible. And that's cool, but that's not a taxpayer's responsibility to make that happen, right? And so if the point is for kids to be educated, right, then instead of just time-based, we need to be looking at there's some standard level of achievement where we could say, okay, you're ready to participate, right?
So, Paul, if we could go to slide 8, please.
So, and at that point, you can stop subsidizing it. And if the point of doing this is that we all benefit from an educated populace, right, then really from the taxpayer's point of view, they should be subsidizing only things that provide them a benefit, right? And this is, it's like say when it comes down to this, right? As a taxpayer, I get a benefit if I'm not surrounded by people who are illiterate, innumerate, or irrational. Okay, that is crucial to protecting my rights. On the other hand, I don't derive any benefit from somebody who can play the tuba or throw a fastball or can name 5 characters from the plays of Shakespeare or any of a host of other things that kids are studying in school. Mm-hmm. There's no benefit here for me. That is private enrichment. That is making their lives better or more well-rounded or whatever. But that's not a justification for taking my money and spending it, right? And so there's this clear idea in this slide between public benefit and private enrichment. And for me, that's the line. When you cross that line, you've gone beyond an adequate education.
Yeah, and I think another way to say that, right, is you're subsidizing. It's not just unfair to the taxpayer. It's unfair to those kids who aren't reaching that level of adequacy, right? Because you're spending money on kids who have reached adequacy, and it's not fair. They're already there. Yeah. But you're still paying for teachers, you're still paying for schools, you're
taking resources away from the kids who are behind and giving them giving those resources to the kids who are already ahead.
Right. You're taking from the educational poor and giving it to the educational rich. It makes no sense.
Right. And so in terms of fairness, it's hard to think of anything that's less fair than this, right?
Exactly.
But again, you never see this if you're focused on the money, right? So if we can go to slide 9, this is what I think of as a picture of a fair system, right? And so, what does that mean to me? It means everybody gets the same education at public expense. Now, what happens beyond that is obviously going to be different for everybody. They start when they're ready. They take as long as they need. And for most students, that shouldn't be anywhere near 12 years, right? And what could be fairer than this? Everybody gets the same thing, and they do it on their own schedule. And when you look at this, it's like this idea of left behind, like no child left behind. That doesn't even make sense anymore. It's once we give up this astrological model, right? It just nobody's left behind. You're just proceeding at your own pace, and you don't need to worry about things like a uniform property tax rate or an income tax or how are we going to pay for this ever expanding, exploding costs, because you shouldn't need anywhere near what we're spending now to accomplish this.
And the difference between this slide and the previous one, so the previous slide had straight lines, right? These are more curved because, again, we have this absurd idea that A, all kids learn at the same rate, and B, that they all learn in a straight line. This is another point that Commissioner Edelblum makes. Now, if he were sitting here, he has a similar graph, but instead of showing nice, smooth lines like that, what he talks about, they're jagged lines, right?
Yes.
The kids don't learn in a straight line, and they also don't learn in a nice, smooth curve like that. It's more of a jagged trip,
yes.
but
right. But the reason those are curved, Paul, if you'll bring up number 10, the reason those are curved is something else that people don't actually pay attention very much to, and that is if you've got a kid who can read and write and reason and follow mathematical derivations and detect when an argument is solid or when it's bogus, then he can learn anything he wants, and we don't need to be teaching him. And what this means is as a kid gets older, if you are focusing on those kinds of skills, the ability to take in information and make decisions, the cost of teaching that kid should drop to 0.
Yeah.
Right? And so and also everything should be faster, because now how much faster is it for you to read a textbook than to have a guy explain it to you over the course of 180 days?
Yeah, and this was another brilliant point. This was another light bulb moment for me. I saw that graph and went, yes, because it's another discussion that I've tried to have with people, but much more clumsily. Like this is a much more elegant way to present the information, but I've tried to tell people, and in a lot of ways, again, our education system is completely backwards for this, especially in Manchester, right? In Manchester, we have a particular issue with, our elementary schools are overcrowded, and the class sizes are too big, we don't have enough resources in the elementary schools, and our high schools are half empty. Like literally half empty because we've lost so many sending towns, and demographically there's not as many kids as there used to be. So in Manchester, the model is completely backwards from that graph that's on the screen right now.
Yeah, and this is again that people are not thinking about what should actually become. Forget money for a minute. What should actually be happening, right? And one of the things that should be happening is, as the kids get older, they should be doing the heavy lifting.
Right.
You know? And they're not. And to me, the fact that this graph doesn't represent what's going on, it actually goes the other way. It's sort of, going up. It costs more to educate a high school kid. That, to me, is one of the most crushing indictments of the current system that you can think of. Yep. Right? It's just, it is completely backwards.
Yeah, and I think it has all sorts of ramifications. The fact that our system is backwards has all kinds of ramifications, because I think, by fourth grade, the mold is pretty much set. Like, I think a kid has either discovered a love of learning or hate school. And that's not to say that you can't get them back, but it's just, I think, once you get beyond that grade, it is so much harder and so much more expensive to educate a kid if you haven't done the upfront investment.
I think it is. And one of the things, I'm trying to be conscious of time. One of the things I talk about in the longer presentation is that I think what we have is a motivation problem. It's not a pedagogy problem, right?
Yeah.
And so, you take Abe Lincoln sitting there, and he's got a shovel and some coal, and he has to walk 3 miles every time he wants to borrow a book from a neighbor. He's going to learn because he wants to learn. On the other hand, you have a kid in some wealthy school district who just doesn't care, right? And you can give him a tablet, you can give him an electronic everything, and if he doesn't care, he's not going to learn. And so, I like to look at it as there's 2 questions that never get asked, because we're always focused on money, and those questions are, and these are more relevant now than they were even 50 years ago. If a kid wants to learn something, who can stop him?
Yeah.
And how much should it cost?
You can take that slide down at this point.
Yeah. And how much should it
I'm
cost?
sorry. I want you to repeat that, because it's a great point. And as we were talking before the show, I actually used that. I borrowed it today and used it on Facebook. So I'm sorry, I stepped over you. So
that's fine.
Let's say that again.
So if a kid wants to learn something, who can stop him? Right? Especially now when you're just surrounded by high quality pedagogical material at almost zero cost. And if a kid doesn't want to learn something, who can make him? And how much would you have to spend to make somebody learn something they don't want to learn? And if you're looking for yet another explanation for that original Cato graph, right? It's basically, so I think that what we need is motivation, right? And if you've got kids who are getting 4th, 5th, 6th grade, what you need isn't people to come in and read textbooks to them. What you need are people to come in and help them figure out who they are and what they're interested in and what they should be doing, so that you can get them back onto that curve to where they're doing the work again, right? Yeah. Because otherwise they're just sitting around waiting for people to make things fun for them. You know? Well, it's your job. Teach me. I dare you, Right. Which is sort of the situation we're in. So that's so taking that approach has this enormous financial benefit, right? That the cost of educating the students drops like crazy. But it also has an enormous political benefit that never gets discussed, right? And that is, if you've got a student, right, and he's learned logic and rhetoric, and by rhetoric, I just mean the art of persuasion, the things people do to get you to give up your money or freedom or buy something or whatever. If you've learned how people persuade each other, right, and you can understand how other people try to persuade you, and as part of this training what kinds of fallacies you're likely to fall for, okay, at that point, you're going to be less susceptible to specious arguments. You're going to be less susceptible
also known as fake news.
Yeah, fake news. You're going to be less susceptible to bogus statistics, right? You're going to be less susceptible to half-truths and outright lies. And what it means, in short, is you'll be a citizen and not a subject. And that is what we're doing this for, right? That is the goal, to have citizens who can't be jerked around like trouts because they don't have the ability to actually do any serious thinking. Yeah. And that's really the only, if we're not doing that, we have no reason to do any of it, right? That is the justification for doing it. And if we're not going to take that seriously, then we should just
A lot of
give the whole
people
thing
would
up.
argue that the system is quite deliberately set up to create subjects and not citizens.
Yes, and you can make that argument, and I don't know. It's sort of is it a conspiracy argument? No.
Well, it could be that the system evolved that way and that there's not some cabal,
Right.
pulling all of the strings to make it such. It could be just that's how it evolved.
Yes.
you know?
Right, and that could be, but the argument I'm making tonight is that you don't even need to posit that. If you just focus on the wrong thing, you are going to get the wrong results. You don't even need to say, yes, there are people who are trying to, create generations of factory workers or whatever. That could be what's going on, but you don't need to go that far. It's just if you pay attention to what things cost and who's paying what, and you don't pay attention to what actually happens inside a kid who is sitting there, right? And so one of the ways I think about this is when you're dealing with money, money is good for changing what's outside a kid, right? The building, the technology, clothing, what? But it doesn't affect what's inside the kid, right? And if you don't affect what's inside the kid, you're just wasting everything. You're wasting his time, you're wasting your time, you're wasting everybody's money, So that I think it really is almost as simple as we're under the lamppost and we're afraid to leave the lamppost because we don't know what we're going to find out there in the dark.
And that's the third section that we're getting to, right? Is okay, so the lamppost is this whole conversation about funding. And we spent a lot of time talking about what's wrong with the system, right? And again, one of the things I love about your presentation and the way you cover this is you have some thoughts about what it should look like, right? So you're not just throwing rocks.
Yeah.
We've got an idea here on this final section is, again, that magic word adequacy. Adequacy.
Right.
So we're going to talk about adequacy in 3 criteria and 2 commandments.
Yes. So if we bring up number 11, so basically what we're saying is, look, they go towards some finish line, and when they're done, right? But where's that line? Where do we draw that line? And that's the kind of thing that people will just fight over forever, okay? And so, but for me, the line is everything on one side of the line is public benefit, and everything on the other side of the line is private enrichment. Yeah. And so how do we tease that out in some kind of operational way, right? So you bring up number 12. There are these books, the Trivium, the Quadrivium, and these are what we mean by a classical liberal arts education, right? And so a lot of people would say, oh, let's do something like that. It's very, how are we on time?
We got 20 minutes. We're good.
Okay. So, let's go back and do this. But they're kind of arbitrary, right? And old-fashioned, and so you could expect a lot of resistance. I wouldn't even try to go down that road. But if you bring up slide 13, but I want to go back to and look at those, not just saying they're old-fashioned or whatever, but is there a principled way to look at this? And so again, I mentioned 3 things that my taxes are supposed to protect me from: illiteracy, innumeracy, and irrationality, right? And so if I list those subjects under here, what I see is that basically, grammar, yes, that protects me from illiteracy, right? If kids are learning logic, that protects me from irrationality. And if kids are learning rhetoric, it also protects me from irrationality, also illiteracy, both of them. Number, by definition, it protects me from innumeracy. And number is a very vague sort of term there. But geometry, and I would say maybe, and I'll talk about why I think that's maybe. Music, cosmology, not so much, right? I'm not being protected from anything by funding those or subsidizing those things. And so what we can start asking is, for any class that you might want to consider, you can ask this question: is it necessary? And again, that's an important word chosen by the court, not by accident. Is it necessary for preventing one or more of these conditions? Almost you think of them as illnesses, right?
Right. And I think the knee-jerk reaction a lot of people will have to that is, well, you wanna take things away. But another way to look at it is any money you're spending on things that are necessary, you're taking that are unnecessary. You're taking away. This is a fixed pie, right? You know, there's only so much money in existence, practically speaking, that we can spend on anything. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of politicians don't believe that to be the case. Some of them quite literally think, and you know, I think the person who was on the show before us, is one of them, who quite literally thinks that the government can spend infinite amounts of money, and just print money, and you know, we'll be fine, no problem. But again, I want to keep coming back to that point of fairness, right? If you are spending money on things that are unnecessary, it's unfair to the kids who aren't getting the necessary things.
Yes, and if you're spending money on stuff beyond that, it's unfair to the taxpayer. So you know. Yep. Somebody's getting screwed in either case. So if we bring up number 14, we see the same kind of analysis for what you might consider as more modern offerings, right? So we've got reading, writing, rhetoric, logic, as if we actually teach logic, but I'm pretending we do. Arithmetic, algebra, statistics, calculus, geometry, right? And so statistics is part of innumeracy and irrationality, right? Because almost a huge percentage of arguments that you're going to have to deal with as a citizen are expressed in terms of statistics.
This is so much. This is something I have been harping on for years, since I read a book about fear, and how irrational all of our fear is. And a huge part of it is that our brains are just not equipped to deal with the modern world, and they're not equipped to deal with statistics specifically. And I would argue that in today's modern world, statistics are 10 times more important than algebra.
Right. However, if you're actually going to understand, so that's why algebra is still maintained here, because algebra is on the road to statistics.
Right, you can't have that without one.
You got to learn about numbers, and then you learn about variables, and now you can talk about statistical variables, right? And so you have to get there. But then you move beyond it to, say, calculus or topology or whatever, and it's like, does everybody need to learn that? No, they actually don't. There are lots of people who don't really know how to do calculus, and it's not something that doesn't create something for you to be protected against.
And you had an interesting quote about this. You're a math tutor, among other things, right? And you said that under this model, you could probably teach most kids everything they need to know about calculus in 20 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, calculus, don't get me wrong, calculus is beautiful and necessary to modern society. However, what happens is, in an hour, literally, I can teach you what calculus is, how it works, enough to appreciate what it's doing, and then all the rest of it is just, okay, here's 30,000 specific integrals or derivatives that you have to do. And you people learn those and then they forget them, right? If you're not going to use it every day.
Yep.
So yeah, geometry, I have it as a maybe, even modern geometry, because it's actually a special case of logic. Right? If you're talking about, say, going through Euclid's theorems, that's a special case of logic, and so you could do it if you wanted to, but it's not necessary. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about just sort of the basic school, elementary school geometry, where you're learning about shapes, you learn all that while you're learning arithmetic, because those are the examples that you use. So it's really not necessarily belonging there. Now, what's interesting is civics and history, and we'll talk about these when we get to the criteria. Civics and history, I put them as maybes, even though there's a lot of push right now. People are, we have to have more civics education. We have to have better history. And those are things where you're going to get some disagreement, right? And I would disagree. For example, I don't really want a kid in a classroom being told that, what the First Amendment means is you can say whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt somebody's feeling. And the Second Amendment means that the state can have a unit in the National Guard, right? I don't want that to be in the hands of schools. I don't want history to be in the hands of schools, because it's the choice of the book and the way it's all spin, right? And so I don't want that, right? So anyways, and then you look at, French, music, art, welding, programming. Those are some of those, like programming, that's a job, that's job training. That's not education. It's not, protecting you against anything.
Yeah.
So again, you can use this framework to start weeding things out and saying, yes, it would be nice if a kid gets to learn programming or welding or whatever, but that's not necessary, and it doesn't need to be subsidized. So if we bring up number 15, sort of, I think this is my two commandments, two criteria. And they have to do with the maybes. So what do I do if I have something that's a maybe, right? And the old model is, if something could potentially be useful, let's subsidize it. What the heck, you know? And the new model would be this. The first commandment is, if it's not essential enough to be mandatory, then taxes shouldn't be used to subsidize it. And that's what takes calculus out of it. Calculus is lovely and great, but it is not necessary for everybody to know that to participate in our economic and political systems. And so to subsidize it is unfair to taxpayers. And the second one is, if there's enough disagreement about whether something should be taught, then by definition, it's a political issue. And politics doesn't belong in schools any more than it belongs in religion, for exactly the same reasons. It's too important, and nobody knows the right answers, right? And you can use it to control people. Right. So those are the two criteria. And if we go back to, or we go to slide 16, we see that we can add two more columns, right? Where basically, if you've got something that's a maybe, you go over and you do a tiebreaker. And so the tiebreakers rule out calculus and geometry and civics and history on the basis of whether they're necessary or whether they're political, right? And so these three criteria and these two commandments, right, this is a definition of adequate. And it's a systematic, principled definition of adequate. It's not just people pushing for, I want this, or I wish my kid would get this.
Right, and I think framework is the operative word here, right? Because I might disagree with you on the civics and history part, but we can have a conversation about it under this framework, and we can debate that political column and maybe try to find ways to mitigate it or whatnot. But to your point, there's a solid, logical framework you can point to, and you can have a conversation, because part of the challenge we have in having any conversation about education right now is it's just so amorphous and emotional, and you know, and it's gets back to everything we were talking about earlier. Because it is such a difficult conversation, it just sort of always ends up back on money, because that's easy to talk about, it's easy to measure. Right.
And it's just, you know, the question, well, I'll talk about this in about 10 seconds. But anyway, so this is then sort of, you have a definition of fairness, which is basically everybody gets to proficiency, right? And you stop conflating public benefit and private enrichment. You stop confusing or conflating education with daycare. And this directly it addresses the explosion of costs. This approach actually makes all the discussions about money irrelevant. Right? But we'll never get to this discussion until we stop talking about money, right? Whereas definitions based on spending and tax rates, if they work at all, which, as we've seen, they don't, they're indirect. We hope that if we turn some levers over here, it will have some effect that we can't actually articulate why it should make a difference, but we'll hope for the best, right? So this is just a different way to look at it. So if you can bring up slide 17, there's a design criterion that you hear about a lot, like in a car or a knife or something you're buying, where it says, this thing has everything you need and nothing you don't, right? And there's a sort of a version of that I've known about for a long time, is by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. And he said, perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away, right? And so there are these two pictures, and this is sort of an image I would like to leave in people's minds, right? Because right now, when we're trying to decide what should be part of an ad, we just keep adding and adding and adding, and you occasionally stop and go, is that enough yet? And here's the thing, if you're spending other people's money, it's never going to be enough. The answer will never be, yes, that's enough. And we would do better to be cutting and cutting and cutting and look for, is that still too much? And so the pictures here illustrate an interesting point. The one on the left, you could sneak into the museum where that's displayed, and you could slap some more stuff on and sneak out, and people would come in the next day and they would have no idea that anything was wrong, right? Because what couldn't you add to that? This is sort of the current definition of adequacy. We could just throw anything in there, right? On the other hand, you look at the Statue of David, there's nothing you could take away from that wouldn't make it worse, right? And so this is sort of the image I want to leave people with is when we're trying to define adequacy, we should be chiseling it out of stone rather than slapping it together out of clay.
Yeah. Great,
right?
Great visual.
Okay, so if we go to 18, which is just a nice picture, I love the expression on this kid's face, right? And you hear this complaint a lot. Oh my God, we're going to end up with a bunch of kids who don't know anything. And the first answer to that is, that's what we have now, right? Which you can demonstrate to yourself. You go into McDonald's, right? And,
Yeah.
oh, that'll be $3.61. You give them $5.11, and they look like a deer in the headlights because they just have no idea how to deal with that. If they've started to ring it up, and then you go, oh, the extra 11 cents, and they're like, you hear people talking about how the two-party system's in the Constitution. One of my favorite examples is at the Volinsky presentation I went to, a woman stood up and said she thought it was not fair that, and this is a direct quote, I wrote this down, my kid doesn't get a laptop because our town wasn't lucky enough to have a glacier land in it. She was talking about Lake Sunapee, right?
Yep.
This is what we have now. Okay, so the idea that we might end up with kids who don't, we're not any worse off. We couldn't possibly be any worse off than we are now.
Never mind, there's a lot of research indicating that the more kids use a laptop, the dumber they are.
Well, there is, yeah. But so what we would get instead is, rather than a bunch of kids who don't know anything, we would end up with a bunch of kids who can learn anything. Right. Because again, I mean, this girl's in a library, but you live in an ocean of pedagogy. That's the world we live in. And this idea, okay, that you have to actually, stand up and explain the book or read everything to the kids because they're just too dumb to get it. Well, if they're too dumb to get it, it's because we're making them that way. We're not leading them out of, the wilderness of illiteracy, innumeracy, and irrationality.
Yeah.
And, the ideal thing is if we do get a bunch of kids like this, maybe they could actually teach their parents and help turn previous generations around. So that's kind of my wish. So, so we're almost done. Here's a quick recap, right?
Slide 19. Please.
Yeah, slide 19, right? New, fairness, everything you always wanted in school and less, right? And the recap is just this, right? So money is not the issue, okay? If we keep making money the issue, we'll never find out what the actual issues are. Fairness should be about, 1, offering everybody the same education, no more and no less, no matter who you are or where you live or who your parents are, right? And it should be about taxpayers subsidizing public benefits and not private enrichment. You have to give them something that they're paying for. And this change leads to this framework that we were just talking about. It's a principled framework, 3 criteria, 2 commandments, for defining adequacy. And that definition of adequacy, unlike the one we have now, which just leads to increased spending, would move us closer to our goal of an educated citizenry, which is what we all say we want. And it would actually raise achievement while lowering spending. And that's basically it.
What more could you ask for? And so I understand, I think you said that you've contacted most, if not all, of the venues that have hosted.
Yeah, I contacted all of them, and most of them got crickets, no response at all. I got a couple of rejections, and basically one that said, well, we voted on it, and we don't want to hear from you. But, which is unfortunate. Yeah. But understandable, again, because, I'd be going in there saying, well, you don't actually need all the money. You don't need the money you have now. You could get along with a lot less.
Yeah, and I think that the opening salvo needs to be fairness, and not even necessarily the funding. But this was, Ian, I want to thank you for coming by today and presenting this information. Yeah. I ran for school board 2 years ago. We'll probably be doing so again this year. That's not an announcement. It's a prediction. And all of these are issues that I talk about necessarily, right? When you're on the campaign trail, you've basically got 2 camps. You have the taxpayers who are concerned about the bill that they have to pay, right? And you have the parents and everybody else who's concerned about education. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that I think everybody has in common is fairness. Like one of the things you mentioned in one of the previous presentations that I saw, you talk about, what a powerful message that is. That's one of the first things that kids learn is, hey, that's not fair.
They
right?
do, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
So thanks again. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this episode of Girard at Large. Thank you to Rich for letting us fill in for him. Hope the Finance Committee meeting is going well. And I'm not going to try to end the show on his quote, be well, be good, don't do anything. I was going to butcher it. Yeah, be fair.
Be fair.
Let's leave it there. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.
Thank you.